Nathan Kessler always believed he could read people within seconds. A glance, a smirk, a flicker of recognition. That was all he needed to sum them up. But today, on a flight he barely cared about, his confidence would lead him straight into a mistake he couldn't take back. The first-class cabin was a world of quiet luxury. The scent of leather and expensive cologne lingered in the air. Soft conversations floated between sips of champagne. Overhead bins clicked shut as passengers settled in, adjusting designer bags and custom-tailored suits. Nathan slid into seat 3A, a window seat, his preference. He loosened his tie, a silent declaration that he belonged among the wealthy, among those whose presence alone commanded respect. He ordered a scotch before takeoff, more out of habit than need. He had no intention of working. A flight from Dallas to Tampa wasn't long, but long enough to unwind. He scanned the cabin, eyes flicking over passengers without much interest, until they landed on her. A blonde woman sat a few rows ahead, scrolling through her tablet. Something about her nagged at him, a faint sense of familiarity. A news anchor? A fading celebrity? Someone desperately holding on to relevance? Nathan smirked. He knew her type, or at least, he thought he did. He was about to make a fool of himself in ways he never imagined. Nathan leaned back, stretching his legs as if he owned the space. The flight attendant moved past, offering drinks, but he barely acknowledged her. His focus drifted back to the woman a few rows ahead. She was the kind of person who stood out without trying, and that irritated him. Women like her always had a story, one that usually ended in a wealthy husband footing the bill. He smirked, nudging the man beside him, a quiet, well-dressed traveler who seemed more interested in his magazine than small talk. But Nathan wasn't one to take silence as a sign to stop. Ever notice how some people think a designer bag makes them important? He said, voice just loud enough to carry. His seatmate gave a polite chuckle without looking up. That was good enough for Nathan. She's got the look, he continued, tilting his head toward the blonde. You know the type, probably on her third husband. Maybe fourth. He let the words settle, watching for a reaction. Nothing from her. Not even a glance. Nathan exhaled through his nose, amused. They're all the same, he went on. Big hair, expensive jewelry, too much confidence for someone who's never worked a day in her life. A businessman across the aisle shifted in his seat. A flight attendant gave a brief, unreadable glance before walking away. The signs were there, but Nathan wasn't paying attention. He was too busy listening to himself. Nathan swirled the amber liquid in his glass, taking a slow sip as he glanced at the woman again. She hadn't even looked his way. That annoyed him. People like her always cared about what men like him thought, or at least, they were supposed to. He decided to push a little harder. Lifting a finger, he waved down the flight attendant as if summoning a waiter at a country club. Another scotch, he said, handing over his empty glass. Then, with a smirk, he nodded toward the blonde woman. And whatever she's having, on me. The flight attendant didn't miss a beat. She's fine, sir. Nathan's smirk faltered for just a second before he recovered. Figures, he muttered, shaking his head. One of those. His seatmate turned a page in his magazine, still avoiding eye contact. Across the aisle, a businessman exhaled softly, shifting in his seat. The small reactions should have warned him, but Nathan wasn't the kind of man who read a room. He leaned back, voice carrying just enough. Some people walk around like they're the main character in life, don't they? Like the rest of us are just extras in their little story. Still nothing. The blonde woman continued scrolling on her tablet, completely uninterested. Nathan tapped the armrest, irritation creeping in. This was supposed to be fun. A harmless game. Banter. But she wasn't playing along. You ever notice, he said to no one in particular, how women like that always have a sob story? Probably posts online about how exhausting travel is. Complains about manspreading. Thinks every guy who looks at her is out to ruin her day. A few rows back, a woman in a navy pantsuit exchanged a look with her seatmate. The older gentleman with a newspaper raised a brow. Nathan took it as silent agreement. She's going to post something later, he went on, shaking his head. Mark my words. Probably hashtag it too. That's when she moved. Not a dramatic turn, not a sigh of frustration, just a shift. A calm, measured glance in his direction. Nathan met her gaze, waiting for the reaction he had been pushing for. An eye roll, a scoff, maybe even a sharp remark. Instead, she simply studied him. Not with anger, not with irritation, just observation. Like she had seen men like him 100 times before. Nathan felt a strange, unfamiliar sensation creep into his chest. For the first time in a long time, he wondered if he had miscalculated. Nathan expected her to snap back, to roll her eyes, or at least acknowledge his presence with some sign of irritation. Instead, she just looked at him. Not like she was offended. Not like she was angry. Just watching. That single moment stretched longer than it should have. Something about the way she held his gaze made his confidence falter. It wasn't the look of someone caught off guard or someone avoiding conflict. It was the look of a person who had seen this before, too many times to be surprised. Nathan shifted in his seat, forcing a smirk to cover the unease creeping up his spine. Something wrong? He asked, keeping his tone light, dismissive. She didn't answer, just gave the faintest, unreadable smile before turning back to her tablet. For some reason, that was worse than if she had argued. Nathan exhaled sharply through his nose and reached for his drink. He took a slow sip, pretending her reaction, or lack of one, didn't bother him. But it did. He wasn't used to being ignored, especially not by someone he had just spent the last 10 minutes mocking. And then, the moment that changed everything. A flight attendant stopped beside her seat, leaning slightly. Ms. Bondi, would you like another drink? Nathan's glass nearly slipped from his hand. His brain scrambled to make sense of what he had just heard. Ms. Bondi? Pam Bondi? His chest tightened. The name hit him like a slap to the face, and suddenly, the woman sitting a few rows ahead of him wasn't just another passenger. She was Pam Bondi, the former Attorney General of Florida. A high-profile legal powerhouse. A woman who had built a reputation for going after corporations, corrupt politicians, and powerful figures who thought they were untouchable. The same woman he had been insulting loud enough for half the cabin to hear. The realization slammed into him with crushing weight. His mind flicked through memories, news interviews, court cases, her standing at podiums delivering statements that made headlines. He had seen her face on television more times than he could count, but somehow, in his arrogance, he had failed to recognize her in person. Now, every word he had spoken echoed in his head like a bad joke. Reality TV reject. Gold digger. Trophy wife. The blood drained from his face. He had spent the last 20 minutes making a complete fool of himself in front of one of the most influential legal minds in the country. Worse than that, she knew it. Nathan swallowed hard, suddenly hyper-aware of how many people had been listening. The businessman across the aisle, who had been politely ignoring him before, was now watching with something that almost looked like amusement. The flight attendant, professional as ever, didn't react, but Nathan couldn't shake the feeling that she had heard every word. And Pam Bondi? She didn't have to do anything at all. She had already won. Nathan's confidence, so steady, so unshakable just minutes ago, crumbled in real time. He struggled to find something to say, something to claw back his dignity. But for the first time in a long time, he was speechless. Nathan's smirk vanished. His fingers tightened around the armrest as reality settled in. Pam Bondi. His pulse quickened. He forced a chuckle, the kind that sounded natural when confidence was high but felt hollow when everything was crumbling. "Oh," he muttered, shaking his head slightly. "I thought you looked familiar. Didn't realize I was in the presence of Florida royalty." She didn't react. Not a glance. Not a smirk. Not even a flicker of amusement. She simply turned a page on her tablet, as if the entire conversation, his presence, his existence, meant nothing. That stung. If she had fired back, if she had scolded him, humiliated him with a sharp response, he could have spun it into a joke, played it off, saved face. But this was worse. Nathan cleared his throat, shifting in his seat. His eyes darted around the cabin. The businessman across the aisle wasn't pretending to ignore him anymore. His expression was unreadable, but there was something in his posture, something that told Nathan he had been watching all along. The older gentleman with the newspaper flicked his gaze upward, brows slightly raised, before returning to his reading. The flight attendant moved down the aisle, her face neutral. But Nathan knew she had heard everything. His chest tightened. People weren't laughing with him. They weren't annoyed by her. They were judging him. Nathan licked his lips, suddenly dry. He needed to recover, to reclaim control of the room. He turned toward her slightly, lowering his voice. "So," he started, keeping it light, "you must get this all the time. People not realizing who you are." Nothing. She didn't even blink. His stomach twisted. Why was this getting to him? He had walked into boardrooms and shut down billion-dollar negotiations without breaking a sweat. He had delivered speeches that commanded entire crowds. And yet, this woman, doing absolutely nothing, was unraveling him. Nathan forced a breath through his nose, sitting back. Fine. Let them judge. He reached for his drink, eager for something, anything, to ground him. But before he could take a sip, the flight attendant returned. "Another drink, sir?" Nathan opened his mouth, then hesitated. For the first time in years, Scotch didn't sound right. He swallowed, pressing his lips together. "Just water." She nodded, took his empty glass, and walked away. And that's when it happened. A flicker, the smallest movement from Pam. She still didn't turn, still didn't acknowledge him. But in that brief second, Nathan caught it. The faintest glint of amusement in her eyes. She had been watching. She had been waiting. And now, she was enjoying every second of his discomfort. Nathan felt something he hadn't in a long time. Small. For years, he had strutted through life with unshakable confidence, assuming every room belonged to him, that every conversation revolved around his voice. But here, at 35,000 feet, surrounded by people who had just witnessed his downfall, he wasn't the powerful one. Pam Bondi had put him in his place without saying a single word. And he hated that. His fingers tapped against the tray table. His mind scrambled for an exit strategy, a way to turn this moment around. But there was nothing to fix. The damage was done. For the rest of the flight, Nathan sat in silence, staring out the window, the weight of his own arrogance pressing down on him like an anchor. Nathan sat stiffly in his seat, fingers curled against the armrest. The hum of the plane filled the silence between his thoughts. He had spent years walking into rooms like he owned them, speaking like his words carried more weight than anyone else's. People laughed at his jokes, nodded when he spoke, even when he had nothing meaningful to say. But here, right now, he wasn't the center of attention. Pam Bondi hadn't put him in his place with sharp words or a public takedown. She hadn't needed to. His own arrogance had done the job for her. Nathan let out a slow breath, staring at his reflection in the cabin window. How had he not recognized her? How had he let his own assumptions cloud reality? Because that was the problem, wasn't it? He hadn't seen her for who she was. He had seen what he wanted to see. A woman who fit into a neat little box, one he could mock and dismiss. But she wasn't some socialite flaunting wealth. She wasn't a reality TV star clinging to relevance. She was a woman who had built power through intelligence, not privilege. And he had just made a fool of himself in front of her. Nathan exhaled, rubbing his temple. He had been so sure of himself, so convinced that his view of the world was the only one that mattered. But respect wasn't about money. It wasn't about being the loudest voice in the room. It wasn't about putting others down just to feel important. It was about character. His eyes flicked toward Pam again. She hadn't glanced his way since the flight attendant addressed her by name. She didn't need to. She had moved on, and that was what stung the most. She hadn't even deemed him worth a second thought. Nathan's stomach twisted at the realization. He had spent the entire flight thinking she was beneath him, but in truth, she had been out of his league the whole time. His fingers tapped against the tray table. Maybe it was time to start listening more and talking less. Maybe it was time to stop assuming he always knew everything. He picked up his water, taking a slow sip. For once, the scotch didn't seem necessary. Nathan didn't say another word for the rest of the flight. The weight of his own arrogance sat heavier than ever. He had walked into this plane thinking he was untouchable. Yet here he was, completely exposed. As the plane began its descent, he realized something. Pam Bondi had dismissed him the moment she understood what kind of man he was. She hadn't argued, hadn't put him in his place with sharp words or anger. She had simply let him destroy himself. That, more than anything, made his stomach turn. He had spent years assuming he was the smartest person in the room. But today, he had been reminded of a simple truth. Respect isn't demanded. It's earned. His fingers tapped lightly against the tray table as the wheels touched the runway. Maybe it was time to stop talking so much. Maybe it was time to actually listen. How often do we judge people before we know them? How many times does arrogance blind us from reality? Maybe the real lesson here isn't about wealth or status. Maybe it's about treating people with respect before we regret it.